When we started this church in 2008, it was the first time in my then 30-year-long career in ministry that I got to be the pastor of a church that had not just fired its previous pastor. I think it's safe to borrow from Henry Kissinger's famous comment about politics on a college campus and apply it to churches, that politics in church is so ferocious because the stakes are so small. People are complicated, and a whole lot of what we do, a lot of what we say, how we act, arises in us for entirely unconscious reasons. People don't set out to be irrationally mean. They don't set out to be cruel in most cases, and yet it happens altogether too often. What is often very perplexing is that people are able to be good spouses or good friends or good employees in other settings, but they show their darker side only in certain safer settings. When I came to Springfield in 1991, I was offered the chance to completely rebuild a church that had been through such a rough political blow-up that not only had the senior minister been forced to resign, but the ugliness of the process had caused the associate pastor, the office manager, and the secretary, and even the janitor to all leave at the same time. Now, there were only 3 or 4 families that had been at the center of that dysfunction, though none of them wanted to own their role in the unraveling of the church. In fact, when I moved to town, they all rushed to take my family out to dinner, to have us in their home, to send gifts, and make every conceivable gesture of support and friendship. And when the names of the people who had caused the political explosion in the church would come up, I would just shrug my shoulders and say, well, they're being very nice to me. A wise old board chairman in that church said something to me that I've never forgotten. He said, Roger, a snake doesn't have to bite you to be a snake. It's a sobering thing to think about, but it bears scrutiny. The comedian Dave Barry once said, if the person you are with is nice to you, but mean to the waiter, the person you are with is a mean person. Now, people are complicated, and good people do bad things. In every case, you can't think of a single person who was so good they never did anything bad. In fact, as Carl Jung said, the brighter the halo, the smellier the feet. There's most of the most outstanding human beings in history, if they had great virtues, almost always had some hidden dark side that was even as profound as their greatness. It's certainly true that no one is perfect and everyone has blind spots in their personal ethics. And I don't want to make an absolute about this, but to be aware that situational ethics, that is, people who are ethical in almost all circumstances, but they give themselves permission to grossly misbehave in another context, situational ethics is approximately the moral equivalent of no ethics at all. If a friend of yours is irrationally hostile towards a mutual friend, you should assume that the snake is just as likely to bite you, even if they have always been friendly to you up to this point. A female friend of mine is a professional who's earned a PhD in counseling and is a person of some considerable responsibility in the hospital where she works. And she comes from a third world country where she has endured many horrors that would have just destroyed most of us. But these early life traumas come out in her adult life in very hostile, sometimes even violent, irrational conflicts with her children, with her husband, with family members and friends. However, these outbursts never happen at work, because if they did, she would be immediately fired. And I've given her a lot of extra grace because the things she endured in her early life would make almost anyone more than a bubble-off plum. But the fact remains that she knows that she cannot reveal her id, the dark side of her personality, at the place where she gets her paycheck, or the paychecks would end. And her condition is extreme, but to some extent, we all do pretty much the same thing. We know when it is safe to let our id out and when we have to be more restrained. Tenured professors who have no fear of losing their jobs, but who have tons and tons of unmet recognition needs, will engage in ego battles in college committee work that makes me very, very glad that I've never been more than an adjunct professor in the colleges where I've taught. But casual relationships and voluntary organizations, whether it's the Kidney Foundation, the Girl Scouts, or a church, are places where people often, albeit frequently unconsciously, allow themselves to express their power through very irrational ways. We lost a member from our church a few years ago who had joined and quickly became very active, but then an illness in her family kept her away for months. She was traveling to a hospital a couple of 100 miles away to spend the weekends sitting with her dying father. During that time, I called, I sent emails, I texted her, I expressed the concern and support of the church. I made several offers, even to drive up to visit her father in the hospital. But sometime after her father died, she never reappeared in church. And I called to let her know that we still missed her, and she replied that she wouldn't be coming back to church because her father had died and I never contacted her. So I reminded her that I had called several times, I had sent text messages and emails, and her reply was, "Well, yeah, you did that, but you didn't mean it." In popular psychological parlance, this is called gaslighting. It's a form of intimidation or psychological abuse in which you twist the facts to favor the abuser and to try to make the victim doubt his or her own memory, to doubt themselves, their sanity, their character. Was she aware that she was gaslighting me? If I had to guess, I would say no. If I had to guess, I would say she was completely unaware. The operative emotion for her at that time in her life was grief, which is often complicated by feelings of anger and powerlessness and regret and pain. She was in pain, and she was lashing out. Now, she had the presence of mind to tell me not to ever show her emails to anyone else, because at some level she knew how crazy it was. But she was hurt, and because she was in pain, she wanted to hurt someone else, in much the same way that a wounded animal will almost always bite anyone who tries to help them. In more extreme cases, as with sociopaths or borderline personalities, they will sometimes have such an aversion to personal responsibility that they will actually convince themselves that they didn't do what they did, but someone else did it. Thankfully, it's been over 20 years now, but years ago I had a stalker, a woman who had run away from home with her tennis coach, who was a female. So she was discovering her lesbian side, and when her parents found out about it, her mother attempted suicide by shooting herself in the chest with a shotgun. So this woman had been through terrible trauma and was projecting onto me, probably the most gay-friendly pastor in Springfield. She was projecting onto me condemnation of her because she had had a lesbian relationship. And so she kept breaking into my house, usually in the middle of the night, and I would have to call a family member or the police to come and get her. And after she had been put in a mental hospital 3 different times and finally was leaving me alone, I got a phone call from her about a year later in which she said, "I just wanted to let you know I've had an alarm system installed on my house, so if you ever break in again, there'll be a recording of it." That she had, over a period of a couple of years, figured out the dozen or so times that she had broken into my house that it was actually me breaking into her house. Now, that's how a borderline will think. But in this year's political campaign, we see people letting their collective id out so that they can surround someone like Donald Trump with approving cheers. And I had the chance just a little over a week ago to meet my very first Donald Trump supporter. I'd never met one. I know there's lots of them, but Thankfully, my life is pretty well insulated. You know, I'm around liberal intellectuals, and I don't run into the Donald Trump type very often. But I met one in the flesh, and I aggressively asked him, why on earth would you support someone who demeans women, who's pledged to deport millions of Latinos, to stop the immigration of all Muslims, and resume to ratchet up not only our military's torture techniques, but to even go so far as to illegally murder the family members of a suspected terrorist? In short, I asked the man, how could you support a racist, misogynist, homophobic xenophobe? And his reply was, I respectfully disagree with you. That is, presented with facts, indisputable facts of racism, misogyny, homophobia, and xenophobic statements, he simply chooses not to acknowledge the facts. But men and women, 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of how poorly you did in math class. Facts are facts. A madman cannot blot out the sun by writing the word darkness on his cell wall. Facts are not liberal. Facts are not conservative. Reality is not Republican. Reality is not Democrat. Reality may be, as Einstein said, an illusion, but it is a persistent one. It's the one that we have to deal with. Facts can be very persistent, though I'll warrant that very few of Trump's supporters would want to self-identify. I mean, no one, now in my own mind, now that having a Confederate flag on your pickup truck is no longer socially acceptable, they can put Trump for president so that they can still let their neighbors know that they're racist. You know, you can still make that public announcement. But very few of those people who are turning out at Trump rallies or planning to vote for Trump would say to you, the reason I like Donald Trump is because he's a misogynist, xenophobic, homophobic, horrible human being. They wouldn't want to identify that. They'll say, he tells it like it is. He tells it like it is. Or that is, he takes an Archie Bunker view of the universe and tries to make it seem true. Now, I don't want to label Donald Trump as a sociopath, although many professionals have. But in very real terms, Donald Trump is not my problem. My problem as a pastor is the collective id that is being revealed in our nation. My concern is that as the United States has become much more diverse, and white Northern European descendants will no longer be a majority in the United States in a very few years, that we are seeing a resurgence of something that we had hoped was long dead. I mean, I was a child when schools were integrated. I was just barely aware of what was going on when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And we've elected a black president. We want to believe that those days are over, and yet the candidacy of Donald Trump is revealing an id that is alive and well and still represents a fair portion of our country, maybe more than 1/4 of our country, maybe as much as 40%. During my graduate school work at Vanderbilt, I was a chaplain in the VA drug and alcohol rehab unit. And I learned more about psychology in those days of working with recovering addicts than I ever learned sitting in a classroom listening to lectures on psychology. One of the things that the AA program is emphatic about is the need for unvarnished honesty with the alcoholic or drug addict that you're living with. The Al-Anon program stresses to the family members of addicts that they are not doing the addict any favors by pretending to believe their lies, or in allowing them to twist reality to make other people responsible for their behaviors. It's a very basic tenet of either parenting, or if you can turn the noun parent into a verb, then I guess you can do it to adult. It's true of adulting that if you reward a behavior, you're going to see more of it. So you don't want to reward bad behaviors. You want to reward good behaviors and to avoid even reacting to bad behaviors. The politics of exaggerated politeness, however, will make you feel like you should pretend to believe the insanity, to believe the lie, or to reward someone for their petty and irrational ego demands. Sometimes it's just easier to give in to the expectations of a borderline or a sociopath just to keep the peace. I've seen it happen in board meetings and charitable organizations and churches and in government offices where a loud, demanding sociopath will get their way even though everyone in the room knows that what they're saying is crazy. But when you are doing that, you are encouraging people to just go deeper into their pathology, their addiction, their delusion, and ultimately their own unhappiness. Our wisdom lesson today is probably the singular quote for which Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the most famous. In it, in sum, he says that forgiveness without confession is worthless. It's cheap grace. And this is the point where I part company with very many of my liberal peers in ministry, because we have made the conscious decision as academics that we're going to dismiss neurotic guilt and fear associated with religion. We've jettisoned any belief in a harsh, judgmental sky father who watches us from the clouds, wanting very much to punish us. We often fall prey to the popular pop psychology of a previous generation that wants to say, I'm okay and you're okay. Whoever you are, whatever you are, it's okay. We progressives often tend to engage in both amnesia and denial, pretending that harmful or even irrational behavior is not what it clearly is, harmful and irrational. It makes us ethically irrelevant and morally either ineffectual or sometimes much worse, we literally encourage evil behavior by rewarding it. That is why, in spite of all that we have rejected from our traditional Christian roots, that we still have a prayer of confession in our liturgy. They are not traditional prayers. You can't go into a book and find a prayer of confession that we use here, because all the liturgy books that I have, and I've got dozens of them, all write their prayers of confession as sort of a mea culpa, asking the Sky Father to not give you punishment that you so richly deserve. Our attempts in prayers of confession are attempts at orientation to reality that befits a church that says that it is fact-based in its faith. If you're watching this sermon online and you've never been around to hear one of those, if you'll just write to me at my email address, I will send you some samplings of those prayers. Sean and Barry have talked about trying to set some of them to music, although I have to say I have listened to the prayers of Kierkegaard set to music, and I think you should save your time. We've kept prayers of confession because we're trying to make our spirituality real and relevant and honest. It's one thing for people to say, as they so often do, I'm spiritual but not religious. But to be fair, if you're not sincerely trying to live in harmony with other people, if you're not sincerely investing yourself in genuine forgiveness and reconciliation, both to other people and to the earth, to future generations, to other nations and races, then it might be more accurate to say that you're neither religious nor spiritual. To be spiritual means that you're trying to lead a spiritual life, that you're trying to be better than you might otherwise have been. I often think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission used in South Africa after the end of apartheid. After years of violently oppressive white minority government that abused and impoverished the black majority of South Africa, it was reasonable to fear that when apartheid ended, that the majority population would kill off the minority white population, erupting in violent revenge. It would have been a logical thing to do. It would have been a natural thing to do. But before they lifted all of the strictures of apartheid, they created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that gave the white oppressors the opportunity to publicly confess their sins against their victims. And in exchange for their honest confession, they were forgiven rather than punished. and those who refused to confess were held criminally responsible. Many were put on trial and imprisoned. Now, you might think that wouldn't work, but in most cases, what victims really want is not retribution, but acknowledgement, genuine apology. But for forgiveness to take place, if there's no confession, it's not really forgiveness, it's just amnesia. It's just denial. Bonhoeffer's point is that when forgiveness precedes confession, when you try to exercise reconciliation through amnesia or denial, the reconciliation isn't real. We don't want to look spiritual or talk spiritual. We don't want to just have a little church where we clean up and gather. We're trying to get at the real thing, the real roots of what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a spiritual person? Men and women, let me say this in my most authoritative pastoral voice, if liberals have authoritative pastoral voices. I'm begging you to always be willing to forgive. Let it be known in any conflict that you are willing to forgive and be reconciled. But never let anything become so big in your mind that you think, I just can't get over that hurdle, that reconciliation is not possible. Don't dispose of family members and friends, but as far as it lies with you, seek peace and sincere love. But don't deny reality. People don't have to agree with you, and you don't have to pretend to believe their lies or their fairy tales or be subjected to other people's twisted imagination if they try to make you out to be crazy or a villain that somehow works for them if they can destroy your character and project that onto you. Be honest, but be yourself. Engage in reality, but choose to infuse reality with love and forgiveness. Now, that's just my opinion, but I sure hope you agree.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.